Okay, hopefully I'm audible now.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, thank
jolly
you.
good.
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. As Mark was just saying, I've been on study leave this term, which in some ways has been a kind of felicitous timing, because it's meant that I've not had to go into London during the periods of lockdown or partial lockdown very much. One of the disadvantages has been that while my colleagues are now really au fait with online teaching and with kind of giving lectures over Zoom and over Teams, this is actually my first experience of doing so. So bear with me if I'm a bit kind of faltering in my delivery. So yes, as Mark also mentioned, I've been working with the PAS for several years, partly out of biographical accident. So one of the finds I'm going to talk to you about comes directly from a portable antiquity scheme context. It was reported to them. The other one doesn't actually. So the talk is going to fall into two parts, talking about two objects connected by both being images of Roman deities. And I should say that they're both work in progress for different reasons. And the second object I'm going to talk about takes me a long way from my comfort zone normally, so I'll be interested to kind of hear your responses to it. There are various people who I've mentioned by listing them on this slide, who have helped with either one or both of the finds that I'm going to talk about. So I'm grateful to them, especially to Simon Maslin for the opportunity to work on the Oceanus find, and to Sally Worrell for facilitating that. Okay, so our first, sorry, my PowerPoint is being a little bit slow to move forward now. Apologies for this. The PowerPoint seems to have frozen here. I'm just going to. Oops. So it's a slightly delayed reaction. Okay, it's much smoother now. Hopefully the slide transition has worked for everyone. So yeah, so my first object. So this is a composite copper alloy and iron object reported to the Portable Antiquities Scheme from metal detecting early this summer. I think just after lockdown ended a little earlier this year. The find spot is notionally Old Basing, though the field from which it comes is actually north of the railway line, so not on the kind of Old Basing side proper. So it's north of the railway line as you're leaving Basingstoke, heading east towards London. So the work in progress aspect of this object refers to its function. Essentially, it's made of three parts. There's a mask with a face on it that you can see. I'm going to move the cursor. So there's the mask in copper alloy. There's a copper alloy strip behind it that it's attached to, and that strip carries a very stylized plant scroll. And then taking the view from the kind of the bottom of the object, there's the green of the mask, there's the copper alloy strip, and then behind the copper alloy strip is an iron rod. And you can see there's lots of corrosion product from that iron rod, some of which is on the back, but some of which has also come through to the front. Found in close association with this piece was also another piece of copper alloy that you can see bottom left of the slide that's also got some further iron corrosion staining on it. Functionally, this is really it's difficult to decide what this is. The best guess at the moment is that the mask and the copper alloy strip originally belonged to two different things, and for purposes unknown have been soldered together. What the possible future fate of the object may be that it goes to the British Museum, in which case conservation work will be possible, and hopefully some further analytical work which may pin down the object function. So what I'm going to do today is not talk about really its functional life or working life, but about this main mask image that it carries. And functionally, the best guess for the mask part of this is that it's either a furniture attachment, or it's perhaps a piece from some large kind of serving bronze serving vessel from the table. Its height is 90 millimeters, 9 centimeters. So that's the size of the object we're dealing with. So I'm focusing today on the image and its possible significance. So the image, what you see first of all are these leaves that are sort of imposed in superimposed in layers across the face. So this mask-like covering for the eyes, and there with their sort of serrated edges. Another layer sort of on either side of the mouth, and then on the chin, another small leaf that is merging with the sort of serrated edge that marks both the edge of the chin and the beginning of these curls of the beard. So because of this kind of vegetational characteristic, the first thought when this was found by Simon and his colleagues was they wondered if this was an image that might date from the late medieval or even post-medieval period. The green men that you see dotted around the country on, as in this case from Rochester, on a cathedral boss, where you've got a composite representation of a human face, and then with foliage growing out of it. You can see where that comes from. Superficially, there's quite a strong resemblance between the two, but that's the wrong context to go for and the wrong period to go for in terms of parallels. So it's useful to pin down the identity of this, to look at some of the other details. So this is looking at one of the ears. Both ears are like this, and you can see that it's in the place of an ear, and it has the kind of cup-like depression within it, but it's not actually an ear. Those aren't recognizable lobes. It's more like a seaweed frond in its appearance. And then if we turn the object around and kind of look from the top and from the side, we're looking now at where the hair is kind of coming back from the temple, you can see that here there's another element which has got this kind of lobe-like terminals on it. This could be again, another sort of seaweed frond, or it could even be a fishtail, something like that. It's a little bit difficult to attribute either to a plant or animal form. But we're getting the sense of it's vegetation, but maybe more likely to be marine vegetation rather than terrestrial vegetation. And then if we turn our mask over again and look at the sides, what you can see on either side that I've framed with those red ovals are two dolphins emerging out of the hair that's just behind the ears and kind of frolicking downwards towards the chin. And then beneath the dolphins, there are these twisting strands of the beard that are kind of overlapping and curling around each other. And then rising up in kind of luxuriant abundance from the temple are more of these twisting curls. Those curls are also inhabited. So you can see in the oval at the top, on either side, we've got a head that's kind of turned into the middle, two heads turning towards each other. So clearly having these marine elements, the dolphins, the kind of the seaweed-like features, that takes us away from the green man into a different context. And we can parallel the image in Roman art. So this is the kind of thing that we're looking at. This is a similar sized example of a similar face from Roman Cologne, now in the major Roman museum in the city. And you can see it's got represented in a different way. It's a different interpretation, but it's the same entity. We've got heads of two dolphins kind of emerging from between some of the strands of the beard that I've ringed in red. On the cheeks of this figure are also some of these kind of plant-like elements, and then also up on the forehead where the kind of hair begins to rise in these twinned crests. Emerging out of the forehead, again, we've got a pair of elements, but in this case, it's two lobster claws that are kind of springing up from the temple. And here we begin to diverge a bit from our old Basing mask, because the two elements that are coming up from those temples aren't quite matching that. So our search for parallels goes a little bit further. And what I think we have at Old Basing is actually a sea serpent on either side of the head. As my parallel to support this, I'm going to a different medium. So this is looking at a close-up of one of the friezes from the Serapis in Rome. The Serapis is a monument that's created under the auspices of the Emperor Augustus to celebrate his the peace he's achieved after very extensive bloodshed in the Mediterranean. And one of the images has a seated goddess, and around the goddess is curling a sea serpent. And the sea serpent is an illusion to the victory that Augustus has won over his rival Mark Antony at the sea battle in Actium. So this is a kind of, it's a triumphal kind of note within the scene. And if you look at the sea serpent's head, it's got this kind of frill, this sort of series of frilly scales that kind of mark the back of its jawline and the back of its head. And then if you go over to the old Basing find, you can see again at the back of the head of the creature, you've got that same kind of frilled appearance, and there may be an ear sort of tipped backwards just here. And then again, zooming in to the front of the old Basing creature's head, you can see a likely kind of slightly open mouth. There's a recess for the eye and so on. So I think a kind of a sea serpent, or a ketos is the ancient name for this, is the likely identity of these two creatures that are rising out of our old Basing mask's head. So all in all, what we can do with this, taking these kind of composite features, the combination of human, vegetational and marine features, this is clearly a representation of the god Ocean. So the Romans have the Greeks and Romans have a standardized way of representing a personification of Ocean as this male figure with wild hair and wild beard, and within the hair and beard and across the face, lots of these composite elements. So in looking into the background of the old Basing find, I came across two bronzes that I didn't know at all before, that I think are some of the nicest kind of bronzes, or most striking bronzes to survive from antiquity. So this is a little bit bigger. This is about 17 centimeters across. It's another copper alloy mask, though it was kind of jazzed up a bit with some copper and silver inlay dotted around here and there. You can see that it's got the same mixture of features. We've got our two sea serpents emerging from the top of the head with their teeth kind of nicely picked out. And then we've got this kind of riot of marine life going on down in the beard. So there are mollusks and there are dolphins, and you can see what look like either octopus or squid right at the bottom. Kind of the hair and beard are kind of curled as if they're being, sometimes it's not quite clear where hair curl ends and sea creature begins. Other elements too are quite ambiguous. If you look at the eyebrows, you can see, is that supposed to be some sort of marine creature, or is it supposed to be just a kind of a knotted brow? You know, this is Oceanus kind of staring us out with this rather severe look. And the background to this representation, why is Ocean represented in this way? Well, the kind of the personification of Ocean goes back a long way. So some of the earliest Greek writers talk about Ocean as a divine kind of personified force. So you'll meet Ocean in Homer, for example. But through the second half of the first millennium BC, Greek travelers and soldiers and traders are traveling very widely. They're reaching both the Atlantic coast in Western Europe and in North Africa, and they're also going as far as the Persian Gulf and as India. So they're conscious that there are really these two enormous bodies of water kind of at the edge of their experience. And so it's the kind of Greco-Roman tradition to represent natural features using a personified form. So that's partly why Ocean takes this form, you know, as a way of kind of representing this geographical entity. But within Greek mythology and within Greek cosmology, both of which are inherited by Rome, Ocean also has this role as a kind of primordial force. So sometimes he's a progenitor figure for the gods themselves, but at the very least, he's the progenitor for all watercourses and all life that lives within them. So what these representations are trying to do are both trying to conjure up a sense of that rather kind of awe-inspiring or maybe even terrifying potency, you know, that sheer uncontrollability of this natural force, but also its kind of its life-giving potential. So hence the riot of creatures that's here. This is likely to be maybe a spout element for a water feature or something like that. There's another very evocative representation of Ocean that I came across in researching this. The one we saw before was from a villa site in southern Germany. This one's from a more appropriate place. So this is from a city called Lixus. Lixus is on the Moroccan coast, just south of the Straits of Gibraltar. Lixus has a long history as a city, so it's a Phoenician foundation at the beginning of the first millennium BC, and it's placed where it is because it's at the mouth of a river that takes you into the North African hinterland. So it's a useful kind of nodal place. It's close to the mouth of the Mediterranean where it meets the Atlantic, but it's also a good place to stop if you want to trade with the interior of Morocco. The city has a long life over a millennium and a half from going into the late Roman period. It's just before the turn of the millennia, so during the reign of Augustus, there's an Augustan client king on the throne here, so a king who's friendly towards Rome, called Juba II. He constructs a palace on the top of the hill that you can see here in the bottom left. At the time he constructs it, this hill would have been right by the Atlantic itself. Since then, the river at the foot has pushed its mouth 3 or 4 kilometers further out, so the setting is a bit less dramatic. His palace has been excavated intermittently since the end of the 19th century by French and Spanish and Moroccan archaeologists, and what it preserves are lots of fragments of furniture, bronze fittings from furniture, of which our ocean mask here is one. And this one's a little bit different. It's got lobster claws at the top. There's slightly less abundant marine life. I think what this one achieves a little bit more nicely is to kind of get that sense of, the surface of the sea being kind of moved in a squall, the way that the hair and beard are kind of flicked up in different directions, some strands moving one way, some strands moving another, kind of nicely captures that characteristic of a day when the sea's not very calm. You're dining up in this palace and you've got, maybe this is a couch fitting or something like that. You're reclining on a couch that shows ocean while you're looking over ocean, probably consuming some products of ocean here. So that's our god. So we can identify him. We've got parallels that we can go to. We can see the tradition in which he sits. These masks are not very common. I could only find a handful of them from across the empire to parallel with the old Basing mask, but nonetheless, the iconographic tradition is an existing one. You can put a label to it. That label's interesting in itself, but then we might wonder a little bit more about the context of this object in Britain. What's it doing in Britain? How might viewers in Britain have seen it? What might they have made of it? So to say a little bit more about it, we might want to pin down its date, first of all. We do have some ocean representations from Britain that I'm showing you on the right. Top right is a famous image that I expect many people here will have seen. This is the pediment image from Roman Bath. So this is the image of the god who looked out on worshippers of Bath as they came to drop their curse tablets in the hot spring. And it's a male image. It's a male gorgon. There are wings coming out of the top of the head. You can see one wing on the left here, one wing on the right. But apart from its gorgonness, the image is otherwise modeled on the figure of Ocean with this wild kind of snaking hair and beard. That's a late 1st century image. Bottom right, we've got an image from a piece of late Roman silverware, the Mildenhall Great Dish, on display in the British Museum. Both of these show Ocean represented in a pretty similar form. So stylistically, you can't get very far with the image. So I would have, under normal circumstances, for a portable antiquities scheme object found by a metal detectorist, I wouldn't have been able to say very much more about dating beyond saying it's Roman. 1st to 4th century AD is a broad bracket in which we can put it. However, in this case, there has been some follow-up field work. So Reading University, under the auspices of Mike Fulford, undertook a small-scale excavation on the find spot. And this was disappointing in some ways. It didn't reveal any more bronzes. What it shows is that this piece has been deposited as a broken piece. It's no longer part of what it was originally connected to. It seems to have been deposited close to a cattle skull, so maybe with a cow head that it's been put in the ground. It's then sealed beneath a cobbled floor. Above that cobbled floor, a layer of earth has accumulated. That layer of earth has 2nd century pottery in it. So what we would say on the basis of that is that our head probably goes in our mask of Ocean probably goes in the ground in the later 1st or 2nd centuries AD. That's the likely dating of it. Because of the association with the cattle head, could it be that it's placed in the ground as some sort of votive offering, as some sort of sacrificial ritual, that the mask is seen as appropriate? Maybe it's recognized for what it is. It's a representation of a god. That's without much more information on the context and the very small scale excavation that was done. It's difficult to sort of push that argument too hard. What we can say a little bit more about is how Ocean might have been perceived, what people might have made of him. So obviously, the way in which this figure will have been perceived or read will have depended on the viewer's familiarity with the wider kind of Greco-Roman image repertoire. Did they know their gods? Were they able to identify attributes? So for some viewers, presumably it will have been a kind of intriguing or awe-inspiring or terrifying face, an embellishment to a fancy piece of furniture, an anthropomorphic image that's a sign of the kind of the resources of the purchaser to have a nicely decorated object. That's maybe a kind of a minimum view of it. If we're thinking about people who are kind of the viewers who would have been familiar with the image repertoire, what would they have made of it? Well, one context for Ocean is as a party god. So you'll meet sometimes, for example, Ocean features on a small number of Romano-British mosaics. So this is Ocean from Withington. This is a mosaic panel that's now in the British Museum. And you can see, again, it's the same features. We've got Ocean with his unkempt hair, his lobster claws bursting out of the sides of his head, and then there are these dolphins kind of exploding from the sides of his face. And separately on the mosaic, there's a kind of cavalcade of hybrid marine animals following Ocean along. So it's a procession. The processional aspect quite often goes with the god Bacchus. So going to our Milden Hall great dish that I showed you a picture of before, just the central roundel with Ocean in it. This is divided up into two registers. There are two circles of life going on around Ocean. In the first circle, it's a marine parade. So you've got all kinds of exotic hybrid creatures cavorting around Ocean. So we've got nymphs and then we've got hybrids, it alternates. And then in the outermost part of the circle, you've got Bacchus himself, the god of wine, and you've got a drunken Hercules falling over. And there are satyrs and there are people playing pipes and so on. The kind of thing that you do in a kind of rather drunken celebration. So one way we could think maybe viewers read the Basingstoke Ocean was as an evocation of a well-watered and well-fed party. The good things of land and sea brought by Bacchus and the gods with whom Bacchus is associated to the feast. So that could be one kind of feeling that Ocean conjures up. You've been invited to dinner, and the furnishings, the floor, the mosaics on the floor, the decoration on the furniture, the vessels that are put in front of you, talk to you about the good time that your host hopes you will have. And it's maybe also a bit of a challenge. Can you spot who this is? It's partly a kind of game piece. Do you know your attributes? Can you talk about this one? Can you compare it to another one? With the shift in context, though, the meaning can also shift. This is another quite recent find that people may well have seen. This is a tombstone excavated in 2015 from Cirencester. And unusual, most Romano-British tombstones don't carry much in the way of decoration. They're usually fairly austere with just the epitaph and a frame to contain the epitaph. This one above the epitaph, up in the pediment, up in that triangular space, had an image of Ocean. Interestingly, it's an image that's been deliberately defaced, so the face has been chiseled away, but there's enough that survives that tells you that it's Oceanus himself. You can see the kind of the remains of those claws that are coming out of his forehead. He's a useful figure for pediments because you can just make his hair kind of scroll into the corner so that you're not leaving loads of empty space in the triangle. You can kind of tease out those strands to fill up the whole of the pediment. So one of the other aspects of thought that goes with ocean is that ocean is right at the boundaries of the earth, not only the geographical boundaries, but also the conceptual boundaries between living and dead. And one variant of Greek and Roman afterlife beliefs holds that if you travel far enough west over ocean, you'll come to the Isles of the Blessed. So in a funerary context, meeting ocean, this would be a kind of an evocation of the blessed afterlife. And even outside the context of the tomb or of the funeral, maybe encountering ocean on a piece of furniture or on a vessel could also be a kind of memento mori, kind of remember, human, that you're mortal, and kind of have a good time now, because they may not always be here. A final context that I want briefly to note for ocean is more of a kind of political one. So as I mentioned, the encounters by Greek travelers and traders and soldiers with the geographical boundaries of their world, west at the Atlantic, east at the Indian Ocean, gives a sense that the earth is bounded. There's only so far you can travel. There's only so far you can extend your political or military hegemony. And so Romans quite often use ocean as a symbol for the extent of their conquest, the vast geographical extent of this. We've already seen one piece of propaganda created under the auspices of the Emperor Augustus, and this is another one. So this is a very large gem. It's a Sardonyx gem, so it's a hard stone that comes in coloured layers, and you chip away at one layer that's in a light colour to reveal a darker background in another. So that's what's happened here. In the bottom part of this scene, you've got a series of barbarian captives being humiliated. In the top part, you've got the Emperor Augustus seated in the company of his family members and also the company of the gods. And behind him are two figures. There's one standing woman who's putting a wreath on his head. He's the conqueror. And there's a bearded figure beside her. The woman is oikoumene. She's a representation, a personification of all the peoples of the earth. The bearded figure is ocean. So this is Augustus as as world conqueror by land and sea, and hence he's stripped to the waist. That's not his usual Roman emperor guise. This is him in the appearing as Jupiter, with the scepter that Jupiter would have as a symbol of of global rule. So this is also what ocean can evoke to a Roman viewer. And so this is what some Roman observers say about the ocean to their west and to their north. So Tacitus says that basically when you come as far north as you can get in Northern Europe, this is what you meet. That vast ocean that ships very rarely dare to approach. This is the barrier beyond which we cannot go. The second excerpt, so that's Tacitus writing late 1st century AD. The second excerpt comes from the early 4th century AD, and it's a speech of praise towards in honor of the Emperor Constantine. And the speech of praise is talking about his father, Constantius Chlorus. Constantius Chlorus dies in Britain. He dies in AD 306, and then Constantine launches a successful bid for the throne. But the speechwriter describes Constantius as if being particularly pleased to be in Britain and to die. So when he's about to join the gods, as it were, he looks out over the sea and thinks he's on the brink of stepping into that vast outer cosmos. He's on the edge of the known world, but also on the edge between that differentiates Earth from the heavens. And so having arrived in Britain, he's already taken some steps towards passing into Olympian company once he passes through the barrier of life and death. That means if you're conquering somewhere like Britain, it also puts you partly in control of ocean. The victory that you've won is a victory over ocean itself, as well as of a rather poor and insignificant land mass in the northwestern extremity of Europe. That's one of the attractions of Britain for Roman conquerors. They're not going to make any money out of it, but the prestige is potentially quite significant. And one sees that occasionally in inscriptions, Roman travelers to Britain making dedications to Ocean. Ocean is a god who you find in images scattered across the empire, but you almost never find dedications to him. He's not a regular subject of Roman worship. But here's a Greek individual turning up in Roman York and creating these two dedications in Greek. They're small bronze plates. He's punched out the letters into them to spell out his dedications. One relates to the Roman official who's in control in York. It's a legionary headquarters. And the other is dedicated to Ocean and his wife. The man's name, Demetrius, we think we can link him to a known individual who's an envoy sent in the late 1st century AD to investigate religion in Britain, to investigate the Druids. He's an intellectual from Turkey called Demetrius of Tarsus. And this is the kind of person, knowing the position that Ocean holds for educated Romans, that it has this kind of edge of the world, edge of the earth and edge of the world quality. It's an appropriate place to acknowledge divine powers that preside over it in that form. So again, some of our old Basing Mask viewers will undoubtedly have shared the same kind of perhaps sense of awe at the presence of Ocean. This will be a reminder of where they are geographically and how that, how Britain as a space fits into their worldview. So there's a range of possibilities for how Ocean might have been read. A party god, a reminder of life and death, or a kind of a prompt to one's kind of geographical and cosmological position within the known world. So that's god number one. This is god number two, which kind of takes me into new territory. So as I say, these are some preliminary comments that I want to make on this. This is not a portable antiquities scheme find. So this is an object that I've kind of been aware of at the back of my mind for a long time, but recent events have brought to greater prominence. So you may have seen on the news in October and early November, there was a very controversial planning application submitted in Winchester to build a house in a garden just west of the cathedral. So it featured on BBC News and kind of widely across other media. This is the site of the house. So we're in central Winchester here. You can see the kind of the cathedral with the close around it. This is the spot that was potentially threatened by development on Colebrook Street, which leads east from the cathedral close. It's a garden area. That garden sits on a route that you can, on a walk that you can follow that takes you around the whole kind of perimeter of the cathedral close. So you can there's a footpath that takes you through here, along past the east end of the cathedral, and then into the south side of the cathedral close, where normally there'd be a Christmas market, and then you pass through here into the main northern part of the close. So it's a very central area. In the early 1950s, this area was still occupied by slum housing of 19th century date, which had been condemned. The then MP for Winchester bought up some of that slum housing and in 2 stages converted it into a garden. So the view we've got is the view that you see from the footpath. So at the eastern end of the garden is a balustrade. There's a watercourse, an iron balustrade. There's a watercourse beyond it, a stone balustrade beyond that, a wall, and then beyond the wall you can see the east end of the cathedral. And the creation of the garden seems partly to have been to frame that eastern view. There's a magnolia tree here that has sprawled enormously over the cathedral view in subsequent years, obscuring most of it. The garden was laid out in 2 stages as Peter Smithers, the MP, could buy up more land, but it occupies a kind of a rectangle behind this wall. The watercourse that's here had previously been in a culvert, and he opened it up. The water actually runs east to join one of the branches of the Itchen. So it's a kind of it's a well-known place, better known for the kind of the water, the lily pond, the trees, the pleasant view of the cathedral, and so on. Less the people are aware that there's a sculpture kind of presiding, but sort of 3/4 hidden behind the magnolia. So the planning application was put in that wanted to build over most of the northern part of the garden. It only has rather limited kind of statutory protection. There are a lot of objections to this, so the application was rejected in the early part of last month. I noticed also preparing for the talk today that there's another recent use to which this garden has been put, which is an outside wedding venue. So if you want a kind of a nice external spot to get married in Winchester, then the garden is now touted as a possible venue. The part that interested me, I mean, I've often walked past this, has been the sculpture, which you can barely see. It's obscured behind the magnolia tree. In order to get the rather nasty picture that I've taken here, you kind of have to put the camera as low as you can get it under that iron balustrade, and this is the image that you get. For better images of the figure, I've depended partly on that wedding website. So clearly, as part of the wedding celebrations, if you want the statue here to join in, then you can kind of put a garland on his head, as you can see in this image. But I've got a better image from one of the pictures that was taken the last time the site was sold in 2018. And when you get that better image, my initial identification was confirmed by that. So this is another god. This is the god Serapis, whose background I'll talk about shortly. You can identify him. He's up. The Winchester example is on the right. You can identify him by this. He's got very shaggy hair, but that's a characteristic shared with other Olympian deities. So images of Jupiter or Neptune would also have that. He has a very full curling beard, and his beard tends to bifurcate more than those other deities. So it tends to kind of stretch out in two different directions beneath the chin. His hair right up at the temple also tends to be often more kind of combed down to hang over the temple rather than to magically lift up above it, as the hair of Zeus or Jupiter sometimes does. But his most characteristic identifying feature is what looks like a plant pot on top of his head. This isn't to enable this to serve as some kind of garden ornament and plant holder. This is a grain basket or a calathos. So this is absolutely characteristic of Serapis and of no other deity. The Winchester bust is not an ancient one. I mean, there are lots of things that aren't known about it, but one thing one can say with confidence is that it's very clearly a copy of an ancient piece. That ancient piece is in the Vatican that I've put to the left. You can see it's a very close copy in many of its details. The Vatican bust also has the plant pot on its head. The Vatican bust or Modius. This Modius would, if this was a canonical representation of the god, also have an image of an olive tree carved in relief on it. When the Vatican bust was found in the later 18th century, that Modius had broken off. The restorer knew it should have a Modius, but didn't realize that the Modius is also meant to have the olive tree growing on it. And so our Winchester bust is directly copying the Vatican bust rather than other representations of Serapis. So what do we do with this? Again, kind of having identified it, what does this add? What do we make of this? Well, I think it's one thing that I initially wanted to do was to think about how placing a bust of Serapis informed the meaning that Peter Smithers, the MP who'd laid out the garden in the 1950s and 1960s, what his the way in which he wanted to present this garden. What did adding this god to it do beyond kind of just enhancing it as a nice framed view of the cathedral? So I wanted to think back a little bit about the biography of Serapis, what kind of images how the image of Serapis came into being. How would someone in the 1950s, what kind of knowledge about Serapis would they have accessed, and therefore what What was Peter Smithers trying to say by choosing to place this this bust in the garden? So a very brief potted biography of Serapis. Serapis is a Hellenized version, so a version turned into Greek form of an Egyptian deity. It takes two Egyptian kind of creator deities, Osiris, who usually is represented in human form, top right, and Apis, who is usually represented in bull form, bottom right. It takes those two deities, kind of combines their name into Serapis, but also gives them a new Greek iconography that you can see on the left. This is an image of Serapis that was recovered during excavations in the port in Alexandria in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's one of the colossal images that would have decorated the temple that was created in Alexandria. So Alexandria is a city founded in 331 BC, 8 years by Alexander the Great. 8 years later, he dies, and his empire rapidly splits up into different regions ruled by his former generals. And so a Greek dynasty is established in Egypt, the Ptolemies, and the early Ptolemies create this enormous temple to Serapis in this new capital in Alexandria as a way of kind of creating a deity that appeals both to their Greek and Egyptian subjects. So it's an Egyptian god turned into a Hellenized form, and there's an enormous sanctuary created to house the god that becomes a very famous one in the ancient world. In order to kind of convert this god into a recognizable, fully anthropomorphic form, they draw on the iconography of Jupiter, or Greek Zeus, Roman Jupiter. So they take, as I've said, they take the shaggy hair and the beard and the kind of the mature male face and the thick neck. You know, it's a kind of strong male figure. They adapt the hair a little bit. As a early 19th century catalogue of the British Museum sculpture says, Serapis is always more somber and severe, with the hair falling over his forehead. That's one way of recognizing him. But also to represent that kind of that connotation that Serapis has as the fertility bringer. Serapis is very closely associated with the flooding of the River Nile and the rich kind of nutrient-rich silt that brings down and enables Egypt to be so productive in grain. This is one of kind of Serapis's major roles to ensure that annual flood, and so his iconography reflects that that power that he has to sustain Egypt's abundance. Alexandria and Egypt come under Roman rule after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, when Augustus defeats Antony and Cleopatra. But Serapis has already jumped to Rome by then. So Serapis, like a small number of Egyptian gods, wanders a long way outside Egypt. So this is a map showing the places in which worship of Isis, who's his sister as well as his wife, where Isis and Serapis and some of their related deities are worshipped. And you can see that it's a very wide distribution. Within the context of the Roman Empire, Serapis gets everywhere. He has a major sanctuary in Rome. So if you can picture where the Pantheon is in Rome, just southeast of that was a very large sanctuary dedicated to Isis and to Serapis. That its layout is not very well understood, but from the Renaissance onwards, lots of fragments of sculpture have been collected from the site. And here we've got one example of that. We've got a personification of the river Nile. Our Vatican Serapis, the one on which the Winchester example is based, comes from a site just outside Rome on the Via Appia. It's a very large kind of a villa site on the Via Appia. It's sometimes known as the Villa of Gallianus. He's a 3rd century Roman emperor, but not sure whether he really owns it. It was excavated in 1771 and it's bought up by the Pope. It's restored either just before or just after it's purchased and enters the Vatican collection. What the restoration doesn't take account of is that this version of Serapis actually has a series of holes in that ribbon that frames his head. Those holes would have had the spikes that would have produced this kind of radiate quality to the god's head. So he would look not only like a kind of fertility bringing god, but also like a solar deity. so a kind of manifestation of the sun god. As I've said, Serapis gets everywhere. On the left, we have a Serapis from Afghanistan. On the right, we have a Serapis from Silchester. So he's a god who in the Roman period is very widely traveled. At the end of antiquity, his worship is abandoned. This is the kind of what some of the fragments that were left of that enormous temple in Alexandria created by the Ptolemies. That's destroyed by a mob in AD 391. So Christian iconoclasts smash and burn the temple. The site is then reused as a church and a little bit later as a cemetery. But 1,000 years or so later, Serapis comes back with a force and has a kind of rich afterlife. That afterlife is partly prompted by Renaissance interest in recovering remains of the classical world, amongst which Serapis, he's assimilated to Jupiter, he's a quasi-Olympian deity, becomes very collectible, but also because of that Egyptian context, he's also of additional interest because of the burgeoning interest in Egypt in the 16th and 17th centuries. That burgeoning interest is expressed in Rome in particular by those obelisks that get set up in piazzas of Renaissance and Baroque date. So this is an obelisk that's probably from the sanctuary of Serapis that now forms part of that famous fountain in Piazza Navona. This is the context also in which the Vatican, the Pope, purchases Serapis when it's found in 1771. This Serapis travels widely, so he moves from the Appian Way into the Vatican, and then he has an 18-year stay in Paris after Napoleon effectively loots a series of marbles from the Vatican in 1797. They go back after Waterloo, but this also exposes the image of Serapis to a Northern European audience who haven't seen him if they've not been on the Grand Tour. So Serapis becomes very collectible too in Northern Europe. So Charles Townley, the man whose marbles form one of the core of the British Museum's Roman sculpture collection, is an avid collector of Serapis. So there are many images of Serapis in bronze and in stone in the British Museum collection that come out of his collection. If you can't afford an ancient thing, then a market also develops in copies of Serapis. My colleague Emma Payne at King's, who works on the plaster cast industry of the 19th century, told me about this Serapis that recently showed up, looking rather sorry for itself, in an auctioneer's window in Brighton. So this is it's the same size as the Vatican and Winchester gods. Part of it is broken off. It's got a stamp on the back that links it to a famous Roman plaster maker who is known as the go-to guy if you want to have an image of Serapis for your teaching collection or your country house. This is who you go to. So I wondered then, given that history, Serapis is a god with a long life, why is he placed in the garden? So Peter Smithers, the garden designer, is an intriguing figure. So it's worthwhile, the Garden Trust blog is a very nice kind of potted history of his life. He has a very kind of eclectic career. He read modern history in Oxford. He did an Oxford PhD. He was also called to the bar. He was in the Royal Naval Reserve Service during World War II and he was a friend of Ian Fleming's and a possible prototype for James Bond. Also a famous garden designer. So I thought, given his background, modern history in Oxford begins in the 3rd century AD. His PhD was on a man who did the Grand Tour and who would have been well aware of who Serapis was. I wondered why Peter Smithers had chosen Serapis for his Winchester garden. Was it a nod to Winchester's Roman past, perhaps? Was it Peter Smithers was aware of his garden, very aware of his garden history, so thinking about those grand gardens of the 18th and 19th century that turned their gardens into sort of small pieces of the Mediterranean. So Stourhead will be a familiar example of that, with its temples dotted around the lake. Was this what Peter Smithers was doing, trying on a small scale to emulate gardens like this with their balustrades and their sculpture and so on? That's a possibility. I wondered if he was also the most famous manifestation of Serapis in the 1950s in Britain would have been this one. 1954, the Temple of Mithras gets rediscovered redevelopment of the City of London after World War II. Enormous crowds formed to view the temple, and one of the sculptures that comes up is a head of Serapis. So kind of bringing life back to the centre of London, quasi-miraculously sees the excavation of a god whose image is all about the life-giving power of the Nile. And because Serapis is a god associated with the Nile, I wondered if Peter Smithers was trying to both kind of echo Winchester's ancient past, kind of link to that recent rediscovery, perhaps kind of also think, you know, his garden was laid out around that watery feature, that there was also an evocation of Serapis's biography. I wondered too, because the bust is on the framing, it's on the main line of sight as you look through the garden from the footpath. So it's the sort of, in some ways it's a dominant feature, but it's actually dwarfed by the cathedral behind it. So I wondered also if there was a nod to that to that history of conversion in Winchester, conversion to Christianity in the 6th and 7th centuries, well, 7th and 8th centuries AD. However, stop press. This is where information from people who are much better informed about garden history and the biography of Sir Peter Smithers have thrown those hypotheses into ruin, but also provided an intriguing new avenue to follow. It turns out to be not Sir Peter who installed the bust in the garden. The installer of the bust was the person who followed him as the owner of Colebrook House, who bought both the stone balustrade and the bust to place here. But the letter in which Sir David Calcott was a very eminent barrister who became the next owner, there's a letter from the Hampshire Record Office from 1982, where he says he placed the sculpture here, kind of in the spirit of the garden that was there, but he identifies it as Jupiter by the sculptor Canova, and it comes from Italy. Well, it's not really Jupiter. It's almost certainly not by Canova. It's very unlikely it's from Italy. Likely it sits within that tradition of copying in stone and plaster in the late 18th and 19th century. But now I've got to think about why Sir David Calcott might have chosen to place this bust there, and what its placing might have meant to the people who viewed it. So this takes me well beyond my normal Roman comfort zone. It's slightly frustrating to think that it's almost easier to place Ocean in context and think about what Ocean might have made to his viewers 1800, 1700 years ago than thinking about this Winchester bust. There's this gap in its history. It appears in the 1970s through this purchase by Sir David Calcott. Its immediate antecedents unknown. We can go back 100, 150 years and see why Serapis is a popular deity. But it's quite hard to interpret these choices that are made by 20th century garden designers in placing these images here. Okay, thank you.